Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now after a recent visit to Disneyland, I got to thinking about all of the Haunted Mansion projects I've done since starting this channel and thought it might be fun to take a look back at some of them. Now admittedly, some of these are from very early on and look a little rough around the edges, but the projects still hold up. And so without further ado, let's all drag our bodies to the dead center of the room and get into some of my favorite Haunted Mansion builds. I was recently contacted by a friend who received a replica Haunted Mansion gate plaque prop as a gift, but the paint job left a little something to be desired. And knowing how much I enjoy working on Haunted Mansion projects, I gladly accepted the challenge of giving it a more realistic, park-accurate paint job. So let's get started. First things first, let's check out its original paint job. Now before anyone says anything, it's my understanding that this paint looked awesome under blacklight. But my friend wanted something that looked a bit more authentic to the park circa 1975. To get started, I needed to give it a base coat of a dark blue-green color. This would cover up the existing paint and will act as a great undertone for the verdigris patina that I'll eventually be replicating. So I grabbed some black and teal acrylic paint and mixed up a color for the base, and then thinned it out with a bit of window cleaner, since it does a better job thinning paint than just water. When it reached a milk-like consistency, it was time to break out my airbrush and start painting. Using the airbrush for this step is great because it doesn't create any texture. Plus you use quite a bit less paint and can get into all the tight spaces much more easily than you could with a brush. It's important to turn your piece around to make sure that you're not missing any areas. A Lazy Susan is great for this. I would have used mine, but I was being a lazy Derek. When I was happy with the base coat, I allowed it to dry before applying a satin clear coat to protect the paint. Next up is the patina wash. This is a favorite of mine, and if you've been a long-time subscriber, you'll have seen this technique before. I'll start by tilting the plaque up against the wall, before thinning out this patina-colored acrylic paint with water and applying it to the plaque with a spray bottle. You can use any size spray bottle you have, I just happen to have this size empty. Start to spray down the entire plaque with the paint and let it run down the face. This will take multiple applications. You may find that some of the paint is pooling, so tip your piece forward to allow the paint to run out of the recesses, or grab a rag and blot up any of the undesirable areas before they dry. Now I would typically let the paint dry on its own, but it was a cool day and I eventually got impatient. So I grabbed my shop hairdryer to help speed up the process and to push some of the paint out of the recesses, which ended up working out really well. When I felt like the patina was good, I let it dry for about 15 minutes before switching over to a bronze spray paint. This paint will just be dusted over the top of the plaque, so keep a 16 to 18 inch distance and be sure to keep the can moving at all times. It's also important to start spraying away from your piece before moving over it to prevent too heavy an application. This is one of those steps where you'll want to spray a little, take a step back and look at it, spray a little bit more, and repeat until the patina is just slightly showing through. It's a very fine line between too much and not enough. The last step in this repaint is the one thing that will really set it apart, and that's the addition of some antique gold rub and buff highlights. Now I know this is supposed to look like bronze, but this antique gold color really complements the bronze spray paint and helps to highlight the details in the carving. I get a little bit on my fingertip, blot it on a paper towel, and then very gently start to graze the high spots of the plaque with the rub and buff. This is one of those steps that can easily get away from you, So it's always better to have very little on your fingertip and have to make multiple passes than to go too heavy, since you can't remove it once it's been applied. I like to think about how people might interact with this plaque, and those areas where it might see the most contact are the places that get the heaviest amount of rub and buff, since they're less likely to patina at the same rate as the untouched areas. I worked my way around the entire piece until I felt like it had just the right amount, and then I buffed the face with a clean shop towel before applying a final satin clear coat to seal in all the paint, and I'm calling this one finished. You can see how there's varying degrees of metal and patina paint showing through on the plaque, which really helps to make it feel like it's cast in bronze and not just painted. And while it may take longer to do, creating layers in your finish will always make your piece feel more realistic. If you're a fan of the Haunted Mansion, then you're in luck. In this video, I'm going to break down how one of their most iconic effects is achieved, the changing portrait. Before we get too deep, let me give a quick overview of the build. I started off by purchasing an antique picture frame, and built a light box from plywood to hold all the necessary components to create the effect. The light box was designed to rest against a wall with a slight downward taper to mimic the ride. Now that I got that out of the way, let's talk about the changing effect. This effect is achieved using two images, what I'll refer to as the static image and the effect image. In this case, the static image is the Medusa portrait, and the effect image is the Gorgon portrait. The static image is printed on a perforated scrim material. In my version, it's adhesive-backed vinyl, and is adhered to a sheet of tinted acrylic that's set into the picture frame. The effect image is printed in reverse on translucent vinyl and is aligned with the static image, but is adhered to the opposite side of the tinted acrylic sheet. The static image can be seen under normal lighting conditions, while the tinted acrylic helps to hide the effect image until it's backlit. The perforation on the static image allows for the seamless blending of the two images to complete the ghostly transformation. To the best of my knowledge, the use of a backlit image is how this effect has been achieved since the opening of the Haunted Mansion in 1969, and hasn't changed with the exception of switching over to LED lights in its 50 years of operation. For my version, I've painted the light box black and installed two small speakers on the top outside edge. I wrapped the inside edge with a few rows of adhesive-backed LED strip lights and a bit of aluminum tape to help reflect the light better. This effect, of course, wouldn't be possible without the technical side. For that, I enlisted the help of fellow maker Dylan Craven, who built a prop controller using an Arduino Nano, outfitted with an MP3 player and stereo outputs, and a means to control our LED lighting. The prop controller runs code that tells the MP3 player to play the thunder sound effect through the audio outputs, while triggering the LED strip lights to flash in a random pattern. Once the audio and lighting effects have finished, there's a pause before the program runs the effect again. If you're anything like me and not good at writing code or prototyping circuits, there are some off-the-shelf options that I'll list in the video description below. Enough on the how, let's look at it in action. From time to time, copies of theme park props make their way out into the wild and eventually into the hands of collectors, but they may not be theme park ready. In this video, I'll show you how to paint up a couple of door handles to look like they're right out of the Haunted Mansion. I started off by pulling this old silicone mold out of my shop storage and gave it a light dusting of baby powder using a mop brush. This will help with demolding and gives the paint a better bonding surface. Since mold release sprays and paints can often be incompatible, the baby powder is a great alternative. Once the mold had good coverage, I used a small vacuum to blow out the excess, and I grabbed my casting resin. For this part, I'm using Smoothcast 321, which is a 2-part resin that's mixed 1:1 by volume for easy math. It's also super durable and can be easily tinted with resin pigments. I'll combine parts A and B and thoroughly mix them. I won't have to rush this step since the pot life or working time on this product is 9 minutes. When I'm certain the 2 parts are mixed well, I'll pour the resin into the deepest parts of my mold, preventing any air bubbles from being trapped as I pour. This resin has a 30-minute cure time, so I'll set it aside to harden before demolding and prepping for paint. After a bit of cleanup on the parts, we're ready for paint. The paint I'm using has a plastic bonding primer in it, so I can skip right to the base coat and lay down a matte black. Depending on how your parts will be seen, you may want to paint both sides. Once the black is dried, I'm going to switch over to a dark brown spray paint in a satin finish. If you wanted to make the base a bit more interesting, you can dust this color over the entire piece to create more variation. For this tutorial, I went with a solid coverage since the handles on the ride are painted with more contrast to allow them to stand out in the dark. Now that the brown paint is dry, we can move on to the metal highlight. For this, I'm using one of my favorites, Antique Gold Rub and Buff. I'll squeeze a bit out onto my finger, rub it onto my work surface to help spread it out a bit, and then I'll smear it across all of the high spots on the handle. This takes a bit of practice, but if you start off with a small amount on your finger, you can build up to your final finish. Repeat this on all of your parts and set it aside to dry. One last touch for these handles is the addition of a patina. I'll be using a watered-down acrylic paint in a small spray bottle and will mist all of the parts. If you find that your patina paint is forming droplets, give your parts a spray with water to help break up the droplets and thin out the paint. This paint isn't accurate to the ride, but I think it adds a bit of interest to the part and helps bring out some of the carving a bit more. Once the patina paint is dried, I'll dust it with a satin clear coat, and we're done. It's time to take another deep dive into my Haunted Mansion home office project because my stretching room gargoyle replica needs a place to stay. I've been moving it around from place to place in my office, from tops of cardboard boxes to sitting on the floor in a spare room, and I'm just tired of it. Yeah. So after finding a few free bookcases on my local Buy Nothing Facebook group, I thought this was a perfect opportunity for me to do a bit of IKEA hacking to make the ultimate Haunted Mansion themed bookcase for my gargoyle to perch on top of. so let's get to it. I've been thinking about this project for quite some time, and when a neighbor posted these 2 IKEA bookcases on our local Buy Nothing Facebook group, I jumped on the opportunity to take them off their hands. But before I could get started, I was going to need to disassemble one of them so that it could be cut down to a more appropriate size. So after a quick measurement and marking my cut line with a speed square, it was time to break out my circular saw and chop a few inches off the top. Then it got a light sanding for better paint adhesion, a quick wipe down with a microfiber cloth to remove any dust, and then spray painted with satin caramel before applying wood stain with a chip brush to create the look of wood grain. I've covered this technique in a few other videos, and I'll link to them in the description if you want to check them out. Once I finished the wood graining, I powered up my laser cutter to make an arch piece for the bookcase. This is the perfect use for a laser cutter since it's extremely accurate and can be cutting your pieces while you're working on something else. When the arch was finished being cut, I gave it a quick coat of paint and wood graining and set it aside to dry. Next on my list was to make the face of the bookcase a bit more substantial. So I grabbed some 1x2s and my pocket hole jig and built a face frame to match the outer dimensions of the bookcase. I used this clamp to help hold all of the joints in place while I screwed them together. This is really useful, and because of the flat face of the clamp, it won't leave a mark on your frame. With the bookcase and outer frame assembled, it was time to add the shelves back so that I could mark off where to add in the horizontal fascia pieces. Then it was more measuring, cutting, pocket hole drilling, and installing. For the top portion of the bookcase, I wanted to add in the gargoyle pedestal detail from the Haunted Mansion stretching room, but I needed to attach the top of the bookcase first to ensure that I had accurate measurements. So after securing it in place with some finishing nails, I could take my measurements and install the final horizontal trim piece. Then it was time to add in some backing to this detail. For this, I used a cutoff of the rear bookcase panel and glued it in place with some CA glue. I'm trying to reuse as much of the bookcase as possible since material costs are so high and to help minimize waste. Once the glue had dried, it was time to trim out the pedestal detail. For that, I'm using some 1/2-inch quarter round that I cut down to fit the opening. I like to take my measurements right off the part I'm working on since there's less room for error. I also tend to cut my trim pieces a bit long so that I can sneak up on the mitered edge so that it'll be nice and tight. A bit more super glue and the pedestal detail is finished. Then the entire face frame got some quick sanding, dusted off, and was painted to look like the rest of the bookcase. While I waited for the paint to dry, it was time to address the back panel. I found this Haunted Mansion-inspired wallpaper online and knew it would be just the right touch to give this bookcase the stretching room feel I was after. I cut it to rough length, sprayed the back with water, and spread it out with a foam roller to activate the adhesive, and then folded it over itself to allow it to reach full tackiness before flipping it back over and applying it to the back panel. Once the paper was in place, I let the adhesive set up for a few hours before trimming off the excess. Now that the face frame had fully dried, it was time to attach it to the front of the bookcase with some finishing nails. This will help to stabilize all of the shelves and keep it from racking left to right. This also gives me an opportunity to make sure that the bookcase is square. Now comes the best part of this build, adding on the gargoyle. I drilled 4 holes into the base of the gargoyle with matching holes in the top of the bookcase, since this replica is front-heavy. Plus, I live in California where earthquakes are frequent, and the last thing I want to do is have to repair it. So with a few bolts inserted into the base of the gargoyle, I lined it up with the holes I drilled in the top of the bookcase and secured it in place with some wing nuts, just in case I need to move it in the future. I used one of the remaining shelves to hide my connections, and then plugged the gargoyle into this micro flicker box from Lights Alive to replicate the look of the ride. And with the gargoyle at home on his new perch, it was time to add in the back panel, and I'm going to call this one finished. In this video, I'm going to be tackling something that's been sitting on my workbench for far too long. One of the pop-up ghosts from the attic scene of Disneyland's Haunted Mansion. So let's get to it. Imagineer Yale Gracie had sketched an idea for what he called Rocket Skull, which was a lightweight skull that was suspended between 2 wires and would be lifted up with a quick blast of air and disappear just as quickly. In this home video, you can see it popping up from inside of a hat box. I've owned a resin casting of one of these skulls for a few years, but it wasn't until recently when I found these images on an auction website that I had a better idea of their color scheme and knew that I needed to make a display version of the rocket skull effect. My casting wasn't in the best of shape, but it's serviceable. So with a small sanding drum on my Dremel tool, I'm going to remove some of the flaws to give it a nice flat surface for painting. A bit of hand sanding to really smooth it out, and it was time for paint. Speaking of which, the paint will be a bit of a guessing game since the rocket skull from the reference photo has faded with age and clearly deteriorated. So it's likely not the same color as it was when it was still in the ride. That said, my approach will be to shoot for somewhere between the reference and what I imagine they would have looked like when the ride was brand new, starting with a base layer of a buttery yellow color. I'm mixing up some yellow ochre and white until I'm happy with it, and then I'll thin out the paint with a bit of window cleaner and we'll apply it with an airbrush. When I'm happy with the coverage, I'll clean out my airbrush and we'll dust the surface with a bit of white to help bring out some of the details in the skull. Then it's on to the light blue color to accentuate the top of the skull, brow, bridge of the nose, cheeks, jaw, and chin. I keep a lot of reference photos on my phone and will refer to them often while painting to help me with decision making. Truth be told, hunting for reference images is just as much fun as working on the actual prop. Next up is filling in the mouth, nose, and eyes. Thankfully, these were painted and repainted so quickly that the line work was never really clean. So if I go a bit outside the lines, it only adds to the authenticity of my paint job. With the black sections painted, I can turn my attention to the tongue detail. A bit of red acrylic and a fine-tipped brush, and the first pass is done. I'll circle back since the red paint over black can often leave less than ideal coverage, and this part will definitely need a bit more color. While I wait for the red to dry, I'll switch back to black to paint over the mounting plates and tubes. The plate is made from styrene, and the tubes were modeled in Fusion 360 based on a reference photo and then 3D printed. The last painted detail was the addition of some dark blue circles inside the eye cavities. These are hard to see in the reference, but they're there, so I added them. A quick touch-up on the tongue, then I took a step back and decided the paint looked a bit too bright to me and needed to be dulled out a bit. So I mixed up some brown and white paint to get a light caramel color, and then airbrushed the color over the entire piece. This really helped to unify everything and gave it a bit of an antiqued look too. When the paint had dried, it was time to add in the hair, which I know is ridiculous because skulls don't have hair, but I have to assume it added some extra movement to the effect, and so it's gotta be on mine too. I found this faux fur at the craft store, and after a quick trim, had a piece wide enough for my skull. Then it was just a matter of trimming it down until it would lay flat without too much rippling. Once I'd got it sized correctly, I used a bit of hot glue to hold it in place, starting from the middle and working my way out to the ends. A bit of styling with some hairspray, and it was time to assemble the display. I was able to find an antique leather hat box online, and with a few measurements, I 3D modeled and printed a base that fits inside and holds 2 aluminum rods that are meant to replicate the look of the wires that held the rocket skulls in proper orientation. And with that, the display was done. If you've ever had a prop that needed to look like textured concrete, well then you're in luck, because in this video I'm going to share a theme park inspired method that comes straight from the happiest place on earth. So let's get to it. First things first, I need a prop to demonstrate this technique. Thankfully, one of my Patreon supporters, Savant42, provided me with a 3D scan of this little guy from the recently departed Disneyland Haunted Mansion FastPass area. So I threw it into my Bamboo Lab X1C and let it do its thing. Once the model was finished printing, I noticed that I needed to clean up a few small blemishes in the surface, and rather than sand it down, I reached for my soldering iron and this small ironing tip. This will allow me to smooth these areas out without the added dust, although it is important to keep the iron moving so that you don't melt through your print. With that out of the way, I can move on to texturing the statue. And for that I'll be using a new favorite medium, acrylic modeling paste. This can be thinned with water to help with application, but for this project I'm using it as is since I want to build up a textured appearance that will help to sell the effect. I'll be applying it with a pouncing motion, making sure not to leave any brush strokes in the finish. In the event that I do, I can always go back and work the paste a bit more, or if it's dried, add more paste to cover it up. I'll repeat this process over the entire statue, making sure to rinse out my brush with water as needed, since the paste can clog it up as it dries. And when the statue is completely textured, I'll set it aside to cure. Next up is the base layer of paint. This can be brushed on or sprayed, but more importantly, you want it to be a medium gray color. So with a spray can at the ready, I got to painting, making sure to get into all the recesses and overhangs. This paint has a satin finish, but ideally you'd want something more matte. But this will get the job done, and it saved me a trip to the hardware store. When the base color had dried, I switched over to a lighter gray and started to dust the statue, just trying to get the high spots. The can of spray paint I was using was nearly empty, and as luck would have it, it started to sputter paint, which is the next step in this process. So I used it to my advantage and added a light gray speckling. While I waited for the light gray to dry, I mixed up 2 small cups of acrylic paint, 1 dark gray and 1 white. These will be used for additional speckles and are a 50-50 mix of paint to water. To get the speckled look, I'll be using an old toothbrush, dipping it into the paint and then drawing my thumb across the bristles to sputter paint onto the surface of the prop. I started with white paint since it was easier to see, but also because this technique has a tendency to get away from you, and having the ability to apply a second, darker color over the white will help to tone it down. Once the white speckles were applied, I switched over to the dark gray and repeated the process. This speckled paint job is a very Disneyland approach to concrete objects. If you're ever in the park, take a look and you'll see what I mean. It's a little cartoonish, but it definitely passes the 10-foot test. In the event that there were areas where the speckling was too busy, I used a detail brush to soften those areas before they could dry. Now I'm not too picky about this since the final step will help to marry everything together. But before I can get to that final step, I'm going to mix some black into my dark gray paint and use it in all of the recesses of the statue. This will help to give it more contrast and accentuate the shapes a bit more. This also is meant to replicate the natural weathering that happens as dust pools in the low spots of the statue. With that out of the way, we can wrap up this paint job, but I'm going to need some space and some white spray paint for this last step. I'll be dusting the statue with white spray paint to give it a subtle sun-bleached look. This should be done from a distance of a few feet. Socks and sandals are optional. And when your statue, or whatever prop you're turning into stone, is dry, you can call this one done. Well, the cat's out of the bag. The client for this Haunted Mansion door project is none other than actor and fellow Haunted Mansion enthusiast Neil Patrick Harris. And rather than have me tell you the story behind the door, I'm going to let Neil tell you himself.
I've always, since I was a kid, collected and loved practical antique magic tricks, and not the contemporary modern ones, but I've always been drawn to the brass and the wood. And so when I'd go to magic shops around the country, around the world, when I would travel, I would try and find antique things.
Sure.
And then from that, I started finding auction houses. And then I saw that there was a big auction a few years back of all Disney memorabilia. And so my magic and my love of Disney theme parks, especially sort of the origins of, became intertwined. But then the Haunted Mansion door was available at an auction at the Van Eaton Galleries.
Very familiar.
And I went and saw it in California, and I was like, oh man, that's a really cool thing to have, because it's foam.
Right.
And so I bid on it and I won it, and then it arrived in a crate, and I didn't realize it was just a rectangular piece of foam.
Right.
It doesn't come with like
anything
else. No, nothing. So then so it's still sitting in said crate.
And that's, of course, where I step in and take over what seems like countless hours of 3D printing. But
well, I reached out to you because you teach such great tutorials on this sort of stuff, and you seem to have a love for the mansion. And I thought I would just sort of part and parcel it. But then you and I started talking, and I didn't realize that you had the capacity to be as exact as you are with it. And I've just been watching these videos as you've been releasing them, going, hee, that's the person that he's talking about is me. So
it's great to see how excited this project has gotten you. And like, I'm literally printing pieces of it as we're speaking. Because it's taken forever. And honestly, as someone who also watches like Joel the 3D printing nerd and has seen other projects that you've been involved in that deal with 3D printing, I should have known. But I also, I'm just a sucker for things of the Haunted Mansion. So when all of my machines said it's going to take like 30 days of straight printing, I just said, where do I sign?
Glad it's you and not me.
So cool. Well, I think that's all I've got. And
awesome.
And I'm pretty sure that this print is... Nope, it's still going.
You're going to have nightmares about that printer noise. It's your white noise machine.
It kind of is. Cool. All right, well, thank you for hopping on a call with me. And
my pleasure, DY. Thank you again.
And I will be in touch.
All right, thanks again.
See ya.
Bye.
So now that you've heard the story behind the door, let's do a quick recap on the project before we jump into the final stretch. I laser cut the upper transom metalwork design from 1/4-inch MDF and painted it with a brown base layer, followed by a dry brushing of an antique gold acrylic paint. Then I added a black acrylic wash and a few highlights with a blue-green patina color before sealing it with a satin clear coat and setting it aside to dry. Then I moved on to 3D modeling the frame that surrounds the metalwork, and I got it printing on my Elegoo Neptune 3 Max in some Polymaker PLA filament. And then it was time to assemble the frame with some 4-minute epoxy. And anywhere that I noticed gaps got filled with a bit of CA glue and baby powder, and will get sanded smooth. While I was handling the frame assembly, I continued to 3D print the remaining parts of the moldings, like these corbel faces, which all then got sanded with 80 grit and 120 grit sandpaper to minimize the 3D print layer lines. Then the remaining pieces got epoxied together, sanded some more, seams filled, sanded again, and then left to cure overnight. It was at this point that I was really starting to understand the scale of this build. Even though I knew what the overall dimensions were, it's hard to wrap your head around it until it's sitting right in front of you. And let me tell you, this thing's big. Then the unthinkable happened. California got 2 weeks of rain, which slowed the process of the build to a screeching halt, since the sheer size of this project meant that it didn't fit on a standard workbench. So this build had to be put on hold until my outdoor workspace had a chance to dry out. Once the weather cleared up, and after a bit more seam filling and sanding, it was time to hardcoat the 3D prints with some brush-on 2-part epoxy. This 2-part epoxy acts as both a protective shell, but also helps to further minimize the layer lines in the 3D prints, and fills in any small gaps that I may have missed during assembly. Once the epoxy cured, it was time for every maker's least favorite part of making. Thankfully, I could call in for my stunt double. Now that everything's assembled, sanded, and primed, it was finally time to put some color on this project. Neil had sent me a photo of the door for color reference, and after a bit of discussion, we decided we would go with a slightly different color so that he could do a bit of aging to it once it was installed. Plus, there was no way for us to get an exact match since I'm 2,500 miles from Neil and the door. So I picked a pale green color that should work well with the door color, put on my respirator, and got down to painting. Now there's still a few random layer lines and imperfections here and there, but those will get addressed and repainted before it's boxed up and shipped out to its new home. I tried to get some final footage, but this door frame is so big that it's hard to get it all in one shot. But trust me, it's all there. All 10 feet of it. So there you have it, in all its haunted glory. Definitely the largest and most challenging project I've tackled to date, but it's definitely been on my to-do list. A special thanks to Neil for reaching out to me to tackle this project, and also to Elgu for providing me with their Neptune 3 Max printer, and to Polymaker for providing me all the filament to bring this project to life. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.